We are going to begin here with a large square-headed brush. I'm going to dip it in water to ensure that it is merely damp, and if I have too much water, I will wipe it off on my paper towel. Then I'm going to take a good amount of primary yellow and a little bit of titanium white as well. This is going to desaturate our pigment, which is fantastic because innately primary yellow can be a little abrasive, it can be a little bit too saturated, and this is just going to ensure that it's bright. It's still fairly vibrant, but it's not distractingly vibrant. I'm then going to grab additional paint and begin to work that into the edges of my previously applied layer. If you find that they're not blending properly, you can apply additional water to your brush, and this will do two things. The first being that it'll extend the wet life of your initial layer. So by applying the water to it, by applying the brush and the new wet pigment, it will extend its life and allow you to blend in with it more for a longer period of time. What it will also do is ensure that you can move the new pigment, the new color, atop that older color, even if it's dry. It'll allow you to create a smooth gradient. You won't get something streaky, you won't get something off color, and you probably shouldn't get anything that leaves a hard edge. It'll be a smooth transition without teeth. And then once it's the way you like, I'm going to go back, I'm going to grab additional titanium white, good amount of water, apply it to the top left-hand corner of my painting, and begin to move it to the right of the painting. I'm using a good amount of water because I do want to blend it atop the previously dry yellow layer now, and as you can see, it's rendering a fairly smooth transition from one into the other. Then I'm grabbing some primary blue, mixing it in with our mix, and applying it to the far right hand side of the canvas. The primary blue and titanium white mixed with primary yellow should render something close to a green. This, however, is blue dominant. Once we have the green applied in a smooth transition the way we would like it, we're going to make a darker mixture. This darker mixture is going to be comprised of a little bit of Mars Black, a little bit of primary blue, and a lot of primary yellow. This is going to render a fairly dark forest green. And while it's fairly dark, it is still nowhere close to a pure black. We're going to create a yellow very similar to our initial yellow layer, and we're going to begin layering it on the far left-hand side of our green. This is going to be the implication of leaves, of varying portions of our foliage. However, we're only applying it to the left-hand side of our imaginary trees here. To create depth, you need a bright side and you need a darker side, or at least a middle tone. So the light is coming across from the left-hand side. It is grabbing portions of these trees, but it's not getting through the entirety of the tree. Portions of the tree are blocked and portions of the tree aren't going to be absorbing light. So we're creating varying clusters with this dabbing effect and our brush, but we're also leaving open areas. Now, from there, I've mixed a very dark green and I'm beginning to tap it on in the same way I did the lighter portions. And the rule is the same as when we created our gradient. The far left-hand side of our canvas, where our light is coming from and emitting, is very bright. The far right-hand side is darker, because the light can't pass through all of these trees. At a certain point, the trees themselves, the foliage, absorbs that light and they aren't transparent enough to let that light shine through entirely. Then I'm going to create, again, a more yellow dominant white mix, and I'm going to begin working on a bush in the foreground that is going to be separating the background from our walkway. I'm beginning with that brighter color, then I grab a slightly darker mixture and blend that at the bottom of it. Blending the two to a point, I'm combining them. I'm not blending them in the traditional way of moving the brush in a stroke and creating a gradient, but I'm just ensuring that they work back and forth in between each other, that the top is still the brightest and that we're getting darker as we move downwards. Now we are going to grab our square-headed brush, we are going to dip it in water to ensure that it is damp, and we're going to grab a pure burnt umber. We are then going to apply that pigment in the middle of our road and work upwards predominantly in horizontal motions. Now, as you can see, the farther we move up, the brighter and brighter the brown gets. How is this happening? We aren't using any titanium white, we aren't using any primary yellow, yet it's darker at the bottom and brighter at the top. This is because acrylic paint is innately fairly transparent, and the thinner the pigment gets, the more you run out of paint. As we move upwards, the more canvas shows through that pigment, so it's more of a mixture between white and brown. This is going to allow us to kind of test and gauge how light and how dark we want the foreground and the background to be. Then I'm going to grab my medium-sized square-headed brush, ensure that it is damp, grab some primary yellow, grab some titanium white, something very similar to what we initially used on the canvas. Then in horizontal strokes, I'm applying it to the top portion of our road and moving downwards again in horizontal movements. I'm also moving the lighter tones into the foreground, and I'm ensuring that we aren't just leaving that initial layer of burnt umber. I want it to be a little bit more interesting. I do want it to have the light to a point. I don't want it to have too much light, but we can always add shadows, like we're doing right here with a bit of Mars Black and burnt umber. I'm going back to where my bush is, where it's casting its shadow, and I'm applying that pigment to the ground. From there, I'm going to take that same brush, a mixture of Mars Black and burnt umber, and I'm going to begin to implement our trees. Now I'm working on trees in the background, which have to be much smaller. Perspective is something that's also really going to aid your depth in your paintings. You want to remember that the trees in the foreground are going to look much larger than the trees in the background. They may be the same size, they may be similar shapes, they may be the same type of tree. However, perspective is going to ensure that things that are closer to us look much larger, things that are farther away from us look much smaller. So the farther away something gets, the smaller you are going to render it. I'm also using more of a watery mix to render these trees because I want them to be a little bit more transparent, a little bit more see-through, and I want the colors to blend a little bit more with the colors that are behind it, more of the greens. Now, I'm going to create some shadows that are cast from these trees. As you can see, this is a diagonal line. I'm creating it in horizontal strokes as we did with the ground. It's just a darker version of our burnt umber. It's going to cover both the darker and the highlighted areas, and it's going to be the same color, or rather fairly similar to the initial shadows that we rendered that were right behind the bush area. So here we're getting an even brighter mixture, and we are going to apply that to the left-hand side of these trees so that it looks like light is hitting them and beginning to wrap around them. This is going to make them look much more three-dimensional. I'm trying to ensure that my strokes aren't purely straight. I'm creating little winds, twists, divots, and portions within them that look different from the portion right next to them. Then in a bit of a tapping motion, as you can see, I'm blending that pigment backwards into the right side of them. So now I'm going to take more primary yellow, more titanium white, and our old square-headed brush, and I'm going to even take a little bit of blue. I want to create something darker for our highlighted green, but I still want it to be a highlighted green. And then I'm going to apply it to our bushes on the far right hand side of the canvas. I'm doing this in the same way that I did the background and in the same way that I did the bushes on the left hand side. Then I'm creating grass in the middle of our pathway by taking that same pigment and dragging it upwards. Then I'm going to take my smaller square-headed brush, the same one that we used for our branches, grab some primary yellow, some titanium white, and then create a little bit of a lighter green mixture. Then I'm going to draw on individual little brass. Now I'm going to go back to that old square-headed brush, grab more of that green, and begin to work on my leaves and foliage here at the top of my painting. I'm creating a fairly moderate green to get started with and just get an idea of what I want in this initial painting. We are then going to take that same brush, head back to our palette, grab some primary yellow, some primary blue, and mix together a fairly light green. With this, we are just going to continue plotting on varying pieces of foliage in the tops of our trees. We want to ensure that this area is nice and full, but still has openings for the light to pass through it and around it. So let's actually take the small square-headed brush here. Let's mix in a little bit of Mars Black into our green, create something a little bit darker, a little bit richer, and let's begin to plot that in the middle of all of our clusters and start to build up some depth. So I'm using this brush because if you move it about in varying directions, always changing it, keeping it diverse, the strokes themselves will kind of look like leaves that are a little bit closer to us. The dabbing effect is great for rendering leaves that look kind of far away. This, however, is great for things that are a little bit closer. I'm going to mix a brighter color. It's not truly bright, it's just bright in relation to what we're applying it on top of. And I'm going to begin dabbing on some additional light to the edges of our trees on the far right. Now I'm going to grab my small square-headed brush because I want to start incorporating some detail into our trees, specifically on the highlights. So I'm going to grab some primary yellow, some titanium white, some burnt umber, mix the three together, and begin to apply that to the edge of our bark that is facing the light. Now taking my medium-sized round-headed brush, getting a lot of water on it, I'm going to take some primary yellow, take some titanium white, mix the two together, and with this pigment we are going to start rendering our light rays. Taking additional water, wiping it off, more water, wiping it off, and then picking a portion of our light and blending it outwards in a streak. Because of all the water, it's going to be very transparent, and you can even soften it by taking your finger and rubbing it over that area, provided that the background is fully dry. To do this, your background really needs to be completely dry. Here we're just doing more of that. You can make it more yellow dominant, you can make it more white dominant. Just ensure that it is fairly see-through. If it's too opaque, then it can look a little bit awkward. So build it up, perhaps try something very watery, then you can go over it again as I'm doing here. You can add extra light, and I actually really like it when the light closest to the far left is almost opaque and then it dissipates as it moves over into the right. So as the light fades off, you get this really nice gradient and transition from one to the other. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos, and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.